The galaxy had known many species, some powerful, others frail. But none were as remarkable as the Zolfar. Once, they were the shining jewel of the galaxy, an advanced civilization capable of creating wonders. Their cities were marvels, and their knowledge of science and technology was beyond anything humanity had seen. But all of that changed. A series of unfortunate events, including a devastating war with a much stronger alien race, led to the downfall of the Zolfar. Their once great empire crumbled, and now they were a scattered people, barely surviving on their dying homeworld. Across the stars, the Galactic Federation, a powerful alliance of civilizations, looked at the Zolfar with indifference. To them, the Zolfar were a lost cause, a race of once proud aliens who could not be saved. The Federation's focus had shifted to other more pressing matters, such as securing their borders and expanding their influence. The Zolfar had become a forgotten species, their plight ignored by the very beings who had once called them equals. But not everyone in the galaxy had turned their back on the Zolfar. Humans, newly established as a force to be reckoned with in the galactic community, looked at the situation differently. Unlike the Federation, which cared only for political gain, the humans believed in something deeper: empathy, compassion, and the belief that no one should be abandoned, no matter how dire their circumstances. Captain Naomi Stark, a seasoned officer in the United Earth Forces, watched as the news of the Zolfar's plight spread. It was a story of desperation, one that echoed in the hearts of every human who heard it. Unlike the cold, bureaucratic Federation, humans felt a sense of responsibility. Captain Stark was no different. She believed that humanity had the power to make a difference. Standing on the bridge of the Defender, a sleek and powerful human warship, Stark stared out into the dark abyss of space. The ship's engines hummed quietly as it glided through the stars, but her thoughts were far from calm. The distress signal from the Zolfar had arrived only days earlier. It was a simple message, one filled with sorrow and hope. The Zolfar asked for help, help that no one else had offered. Stark knew that this was not just a mission to protect an alien race. It was a test of humanity's soul. "We're the only ones who will answer," Stark said quietly to herself. She gripped the railing in front of her, looking at the crew who stood silent behind her. The decision had been made. She would lead the Defender and its crew to the Zolfar homeworld, and they would give everything to help these people rebuild. Her first officer, Lieutenant Jackson, stepped forward. "Captain, are you sure about this? The Federation has already made it clear they don't want to get involved. If we go, it's on our own." Stark turned, her eyes sharp but calm. "It's not about what the Federation wants. It's about doing what's right." The Defender had been tasked with other, more important missions before, but none of them felt as crucial as this one. The Zolfar needed them, and Stark wasn't about to leave them to die alone. She had seen too many species left to their fate, abandoned by powerful empires that couldn't be bothered to lift a finger. Humanity had proven it could do better, and it would. In the days that followed, the crew prepared for the journey. The Defender would have to travel across hundreds of light years, deep into the outer regions of known space. It was a dangerous journey, far from the protective reach of the Federation's forces. They would be alone, vulnerable to whatever dangers lurked in the unexplored reaches of the galaxy. But Captain Stark knew that there were things worth fighting for, things that couldn't be measured in political terms or star systems. As the ship approached the Zolfar system, a sense of tension filled the air. The crew, despite their experience, had never been on a mission like this. This was not just about defending a planet or securing an outpost. This was about saving a race on the brink of extinction. The first signs of the Zolfar homeworld appeared in the distance, a once beautiful planet now scared by years of warfare and neglect. Stark's heart sank as she looked at the desolate surface. It was clear that the Zolfar had been abandoned, not just by the Federation, but by the entire galaxy. "Prepare for landing," Captain Stark ordered. "Let's show them they're not alone." The ship descended through the atmosphere, and as they neared the surface, Stark could see the wreckage of cities and broken structures that once symbolized the Zolthar's greatness. There was no time to waste. The humans were here to help, and they would do everything in their power to protect what remained of this proud race. As the Defender touched down, Captain Stark and her team gathered at the airlock. They would make their first contact with the Zolfar, and she knew that the future of this ancient race depended on what they did next. The airlock hissed open, and as the crew stepped out onto the surface of the planet, they were greeted by a small group of Zolfar survivors. Their faces were a mixture of hope and despair. They had heard the humans were coming, but could they trust them? Would these strangers keep their word? Captain Stark stepped forward, her voice steady and reassuring. "We're here to help you. We won't turn away." And with those words, the humans began their mission to defend the abandoned alien race, no matter the cost. Captain Naomi Stark and her crew stood on the surface of the Zolfar homeworld, surrounded by the ruins of a once great civilization. The air was thick with dust, and the sky was a dull shade of gray, a result of years of environmental decay. The Zolfar survivors who met them were a somber group. Their faces were lined with exhaustion and sorrow, but beneath their eyes burned a flicker of hope. The humans, standing tall in their uniforms, felt the weight of that hope on their shoulders. They knew this mission was more than just a military operation. It was a chance to heal wounds, to offer a future to a people who had been abandoned by the galaxy. Captain Stark, one of the Zolfar leaders, a tall figure with silver-gray skin and piercing blue eyes, stepped forward. His voice was soft but firm. "We've heard of your arrival, but we are not fools. We've seen many come before you, only to leave us when things grew difficult." Stark met his gaze calmly, her expression resolute. "I understand your doubts. We're not here to make promises we can't keep, but we are here to help you rebuild, to stand with you against the Torith. You are not alone." The Zolfar leader, whose name was Kalar, nodded slowly but said nothing. It was clear that years of betrayal and disappointment had made his people cautious, if not outright distrustful. The Federation had abandoned them. Other races had watched them fall. Why would humans be any different? "We've had enough of false hope," Kalar replied, his voice tinged with bitterness. "The Federation left us to die. You may say you're different, but what do you truly want from us?" Stark's heart clenched as she realized the depth of the Zolthar's pain. Their once thriving empire had crumbled, and now they were a shadow of their former selves. What remained of their cities were shattered, their technology outdated, and their people fractured. The Zolfar were a proud species, but pride could only carry them so far when their very survival was at stake. "We want nothing but to help you stand on your feet again," Stark said, her voice steady. "But this will require trust. We can't rebuild your society overnight. It will take time, effort, and a willingness to work together. We're asking you to give us that chance." Kalar looked down, his eyes clouded with doubt. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the soft hum of the Defender in the background. The Zolfar survivors behind Kalar whispered among themselves, casting glances at the humans. Some seemed ready to accept the help. Others remained skeptical, unwilling to believe that the humans would not abandon them like all the others. Finally, Kalar spoke. "You may stay, but we are not easily swayed. If you are to assist us, you will need to prove your worth. We cannot trust anyone who has not shown they are worthy of trust." Stark nodded. She knew this would not be easy. The Zolfar had been let down too many times before. Trust had to be earned, not given freely. She turned to Lieutenant Jackson, who stood by her side. "Prepare the team," Stark ordered. "We're going to work with them. Let's show them we're here to stay." The humans spent the following days working alongside the Zolfar. They began by assessing the state of the planet's defenses, which were in a dismal condition. The Zolfar military, once a formidable force, had been all but dismantled. Their weapons were outdated, their ships barely operational. Stark knew that rebuilding their military would take time. Time the Zolfar didn't have. Lieutenant Jackson led a team of engineers to help repair the Zolthar's damaged infrastructure. Meanwhile, Stark and Kaller discussed strategies for defending the planet from the looming threat of the Ktorith. The humans would provide the expertise, but the Zolthar would have to adapt their technology to fit their needs. The days turned into weeks, and slowly but surely, the humans began to earn the Zolthar's trust. They worked together, side by side, to rebuild what had been broken. Stark made sure to listen to the Zolthar, valuing their knowledge of their own planet and culture. She knew that they were not just allies, but partners in this fight for survival. However, the tension was always there. The Zolthar still carried the scars of betrayal, and every time something went wrong, doubts crept into their minds. Could they really rely on the humans, or would they be abandoned again, left to face the Ktorith alone? Stark understood their hesitation. She had seen it in the eyes of the survivors. But she also knew that the only way to move forward was to prove through action that the humans were different, that they would not turn away when things got difficult. One night, as the humans worked late into the evening, Stark found herself alone in the command center, reviewing plans with Lieutenant Jackson. The dim lights flickered as the two of them discussed tactics for an upcoming offensive. Suddenly, a communication pinged on the console. It was from Kaller. "Captain Stark." Kaller's voice came through, low and uncertain. "We've been thinking. Perhaps we have underestimated your people. If you are willing to stay and fight with us, then we are willing to trust you." Stark's heart swelled with a sense of victory, but she knew this was only the beginning. The real test was still ahead, the battle against the Ktorith. But for the first time since they had arrived, she felt a glimmer of hope. The Zolthar were willing to fight alongside them, and together, they might just have a chance. The days were growing shorter, and the sense of urgency was thick in the air. Captain Naomi Stark stood at the front of the makeshift command center on the Zolthar homeworld, looking over the holographic map of the system. The Zolthar had finally agreed to trust the humans, but that trust was fragile. Every decision they made had to count, or the Ktorith would wipe them all out. Stark's thoughts were interrupted when Lieutenant Jackson entered the room, his face grim. "Captain, we got a problem. The Ktorith fleet is moving faster than we anticipated. We've only got a few days before they arrive." Stark's heart skipped a beat. The Ktorith, a terrifying alien race known for their brutal tactics and overwhelming firepower, were already on their way. The Zolthar had no military left to defend themselves, and the humans were stretched thin. The Defender was the only capable ship in orbit, and even it was not enough to take on the full force of the Ktorith. "Dame," Stark muttered under her breath, her eyes scanning the data on the holographic map. The Ktorith were known for their massive warships, capable of decimating entire planets in a single strike. Their arrival meant that time was running out. "What's our plan?" Jackson asked, his voice tight with concern. Stark stood tall, the weight of command pressing heavily on her shoulders. "We're going to make our stand here. The Zolthar may have lost their military, but they still have knowledge, technology, and determination. We'll use every advantage we can find to level the playing field." As the humans worked alongside the Zolthar, they focused on creating a defensive network around the planet. Jackson and his team of engineers worked tirelessly to repair the Zolthar's old defenses, while Stark coordinated with Kaller to organize a ground strategy. Despite the overwhelming odds, there was a sense of unity in the air. The Zolthar had not fought alongside humans for years, but now they were willing to join the fight once more. The next few days were a blur of activity. Stark's crew worked non-stop, modifying weapons, building new defense systems, and training the Zolthar in tactics that the humans had learned over years of warfare. Lieutenant Jackson spent hours teaching Zolthar soldiers how to operate the human weaponry, while Captain Stark worked closely with Kaller, discussing how to best defend their planet. "There's a problem," Kaller said one evening, his voice low. "The Ktorith are known for their use of stealth technology. Even if we manage to spot their ships, we may not have enough time to respond before they strike." Stark frowned. She had heard of the Xoreth's stealth capabilities, but she hadn't realized how advanced they were. "How much time do we have?" she asked, feeling the pressure mounting. "Less than 48 hours, Kaller replied. "They will be in range of our outer defenses by then." The situation was growing direr by the hour. If the Xoreth arrived before they were ready, the planet could fall in a matter of hours. Stark knew that the only chance they had was to get the Zalfar back on their feet quickly. The Zalfar were no strangers to war, but they had not fought in years, and their resources were limited. As the sun set on the planet's horizon, Stark sat in her quarters, deep in thought. She stared at the holographic projection of the Xoreth fleet, their ships slowly approaching the planet. The situation was bleak, and it felt like the weight of the galaxy rested on her shoulders. Then a thought struck her. The Zalfar had a weapon, one that had been lost to them for centuries. It was an ancient piece of technology, a relic from their past, capable of turning the tide of any battle. The problem was, it had been sealed away, hidden in the depths of their world, forgotten by all but a few. Stark quickly called Kaller, her mind racing. "We need to find the Zalfar's lost weapon," she said urgently. "It could be the only way we stand a chance against the Xoreth." Kaller hesitated. "The weapon is a myth. It's been lost for centuries. No one knows where it is." "I don't care if it's a myth," Stark replied firmly. "We need to find it. If it exists, we use it. If it doesn't, we fight with what we have." The decision was made. The humans would help the Zalfar search for the weapon, no matter how difficult it might be. They had no other choice. As the search began, the pressure mounted. Stark knew that the Xoreth would not wait. They were coming, and the humans and Zalfar had to be ready. The search led the team into the heart of Zalfar's ancient cities, where secrets had long been buried. The ruins were a maze of crumbling buildings and forgotten passages. But Stark's determination never wavered. Every step they took brought them closer to the weapon that might save them all. In the deep underground chambers of the city, hidden beneath layers of dust and debris, they found it. The weapon was unlike anything the humans had ever seen. It was a massive, crystalline structure, glowing with a strange energy. The Zalfar had used it in their prime, but it had been too dangerous to maintain, and so it had been sealed away. "It's real," Kaller whispered, his voice filled with awe. Stark studied the weapon carefully, her mind already racing with ideas. "We'll make it work. We don't have time to waste." With the weapon in their hands, the humans and Zalfar returned to the surface, ready to face the incoming threat. The Xoreth fleet was closing in, but now, with the lost weapon in their possession, they had one final chance to turn the tide. The battle for survival was about to begin. The moment had arrived. The Xoreth fleet was just hours away from reaching the Zalfar homeworld. The humans and Zalfar stood together, gathered in the command center, their faces tense with the weight of what was to come. The discovery of the ancient Zalfar weapon had brought a flicker of hope, but it wasn't enough to shake the fear that gripped them all. They were facing a brutal enemy, one whose tactics were ruthless, and whose firepower could obliterate entire civilizations. This was not a battle they could afford to lose. Captain Naomi Stark stood at the front of the room, watching as the crew made final preparations. Lieutenant Jackson worked alongside the Zalfar engineers, ensuring that the lost weapon was properly integrated into their defense systems. The weapon was a massive energy cannon, capable of unleashing devastating blasts of power. But it required skilled handling and precise coordination, something the Zalfar hadn't used in centuries. "We need to make sure this works," Jackson said, his voice steady but filled with tension. "It's our best shot at stopping them." Stark nodded. "I know. But remember, this weapon is a double-edged sword. If we misfire, it could destroy more than just the Xoreth." Kaller, who had been quietly observing the preparations, stepped forward. "We know the risks, Captain. But we also know that this is our only chance. We trust you and your people. We will fight with you, not just because we must, but because we believe in what you stand for." Stark glanced at him, her heart heavy with the gravity of the situation. The Zolfar had not fought alongside another species in generations, and now they were putting everything on the line. They were entrusting their future to the humans, and it was a responsibility Stark did not take lightly. "We won't let you down," she said quietly, her voice filled with resolve. As the final preparations were made, the Defender took its position in orbit above the planet, and the Zolfar's newly repaired defenses were activated. The battle would unfold in two phases. The Xoreth would first attack from space, deploying their fleet of massive warships, while the second phase would see their ground forces storming the planet. Stark knew that the Xoreth would be relentless, and that any mistake could lead to disaster. There would be no second chances. The first signal came just after dawn. The warning sirens blared as the Xoreth ships appeared on the edge of the system, their dark silhouettes cutting through the void of space. The fleet was vast, at least 50 warships, each one far larger and more heavily armed than the Defender. It was a force meant to crush anything in its path. Stark's heart raced, but she kept her focus. "All hands, prepare for battle," she ordered, her voice cutting through the tension. The crew sprang into action. Jackson and the engineers rushed to their stations, ready to fire the newly integrated weapon. The Zolfar soldiers stood ready by the defenses, their weapons trained on the sky, prepared to repel the Xoreth's ground assault. Stark took her position at the command console, her mind racing with the knowledge that the next few hours would determine the fate of both the humans and the Zolfar. Xoreth fleet entering firing range. Lieutenant Jackson called out, "We're almost ready to fire the weapon." Stark took a deep breath. "Hold steady. Wait for my command." The Xoreth ships began to open fire, their weapons launching devastating blasts toward the planet's surface. The first wave hit the outer defense shields, sending ripples of energy across the atmosphere. Stark watched the redouts carefully, her pulse quickening as she saw the shields holding, just barely. The Xoreth were testing their defenses, probing for weaknesses. "Fire the weapon now," Stark commanded. Jackson pressed a button, and the Zolfar's ancient cannon hummed to life. A brilliant beam of energy shot from the weapon's core, slicing through the darkness of space and striking the lead Xoreth warship. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. The ship exploded in a flash of light, sending debris scattering through the void. The humans and Zolfar, watching the battle from the surface, gasped in shock and awe. "It worked," Jackson said, his voice a mix of disbelief and excitement. "We've destroyed one of their ships." But the victory was short-lived. The Xoreth responded quickly, firing back with even greater intensity. Their remaining ships began to coordinate their attacks, focusing their fire on the Defender and the Zolfar defenses. The first wave had been a success, but the real battle was only just beginning. "Brace for impact," Stark shouted as the Xoreth unleashed a barrage of plasma blasts at the Defender. The ship shook violently, but its shields held strong. Stark's hands gripped the console as she tracked the movements of the Xoreth fleet, trying to anticipate their next move. "Captain, they're deploying ground forces." Caller's voice came through on the comms. "We need to prepare for a ground assault." Stark's eyes narrowed. The Xoreth had launched their second phase, landing troops on the surface of the planet. The Zolfar's defenses were not enough to stop the sheer number of Xoreth soldiers. The battle was about to shift from space to the surface, and it would be up to the humans and Zolfar to hold the line. "Prepare the troops," Stark ordered. "We fight for the planet. We fight for each other." The Defender's crew mobilized, and the Zolfar soldiers took their positions, ready to defend their homeland with everything they had. The humans and Zolfar fought side by side as the first wave of Xoreth ground forces landed. The clash was intense. Energy weapons fired, explosions rocked the ground, and the air was thick with smoke and dust. Stark led the charge, her heart pounding with adrenaline. The Zolfar may have been wounded, but they were not weak. They fought with fierce determination, just as the humans did. Together, they would make their stand. The battle for Zolfar had begun, and despite the odds, Stark knew they would fight until the very end, no matter the cost. The sounds of battle raged all around Captain Naomi Stark as she stood firm at the front lines, her eyes scanning the chaos. Explosions shook the ground, sending up clouds of dust and debris as the Zalfar and humans fought side by side against the relentless wave of Thorath ground troops. The first wave of enemy soldiers had landed in massive transports, and now they were advancing, their hulking forms towering over the rubble of destroyed buildings. Stark gripped her weapon tightly, her mind focused. Every moment was critical. The Zalfar and humans had prepared for this moment for weeks, but the reality of the fight was far different from the plans they had drawn up. The Thorath were ruthless, their combat strategies precise and brutal. They didn't fight fair. They fought to win, no matter the cost. "Captain, they're flanking us," shouted Lieutenant Jackson over the comms. "We need reinforcements on the east side. Now." Stark's heart raced. The Thorath were pushing harder than expected. It felt like the entire enemy fleet was now on the ground, attacking with overwhelming force. The Zalfar soldiers fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered, and their training hadn't been tested in years. Yet there was a fire in their eyes. They were fighting not just for survival, but for the chance to rebuild, to reclaim their place in the galaxy. "Move out now," Stark ordered, turning to her squad of soldiers. They rushed forward, taking cover behind a pile of rubble as plasma blasts zipped through the air. Stark's mind was sharp, her every command focused on keeping the Zalfar in the fight. The Thorath were powerful, but they weren't invincible. Not while the humans and Zalfar fought together. Across the battlefield, Lieutenant Jackson was coordinating the defenses. He'd taken charge of the southern sector, helping to hold the line there. The ancient Zalfar cannon had been a game-changer, but it couldn't fire indefinitely. It needed time to recharge, and every moment it was down, the Thorath pressed forward with more fury. "We've got incoming," one of the Zalfar soldiers yelled, his voice strained. "Heavy assault units." Stark turned toward the sound of the explosion, and her eyes locked onto the massive Thorath war machines that were now charging toward their position. These machines were heavily armored and armed with devastating energy weapons that could obliterate entire squads in a single blast. The Zalfar had not seen such machines in centuries, but they knew they had to stop them. "We need to take those down," Stark shouted, raising her weapon. "Focus fire on the legs. We disable them. We win." The humans and Zalfar concentrated their fire on the war machine's lower bodies. The Thorath retaliated with brutal fire, their energy blasts slamming into the ground around them. But slowly, surely, the combined might of the humans and Zalfar began to have an effect. The war machines began to stagger, their movements growing sluggish as their legs were disabled. "Direct hit," Jackson called out, a grin creeping across his face as one of the machines exploded in a fiery burst. "Keep it up. We've got them." The morale of the troops surged. The tide of battle was beginning to turn. The Thorath weren't used to facing resistance like this. They were used to crushing their enemies without hesitation, without mercy. But now, they were encountering something they hadn't expected: the fierce unity between humans and Zalfar. As the war machines fell one by one, the remaining Thorath soldiers began to regroup, preparing for a second offensive. Stark knew they wouldn't stop until they had overwhelmed every defender. Time was against them. If they didn't end this fight quickly, the Thorath would push through, and the planet would fall. "Commander Stark, the Zalfar cannon is ready to fire again." Caller's voice crackled through the comms. "It's now or never." Stark's heart leaped with hope. The cannon was their most powerful weapon, but it was also their most fragile. A single misfire could destroy everything they had worked for. She turned to Lieutenant Jackson. "Tell the engineers to get ready to fire," she ordered, her voice steady. "This is it. We hold the line, or we lose everything." Stark's squad took position as the Zalfar cannon powered up. The air hummed with energy as the cannon's core glowed brighter, ready to release a blast that could change the course of the battle. "Fire!" Stark shouted. The cannon unleashed a brilliant beam of energy that lit up the battlefield. The blast cut through the Xoreth forces like a blade through water, annihilating entire platoons in a single stroke. The explosion was blinding, but when the light faded, the battlefield was eerily silent. The Xoreth had been stopped in their tracks. Stark's chest heaved with relief. For a brief moment, the enemy forces were stunned, reeling from the devastation they had just experienced. But Stark knew better than to think the battle was over. The Xoreth were relentless. They would regroup, and they would come at them again. "This isn't over," Jackson yelled, looking at the incoming Xoreth reinforcements. "We need to keep pushing." "Stay focused," Stark commanded. "We've slowed them down, but they're still here. We fight until the last." The Xoreth regrouped, their anger now palpable. But Stark and her team had a newfound determination. They had fought against impossible odds, and they had proven to themselves and to the Zalfar that they could hold their ground. They had withstood the Xoreth's might, and the battle for Zalfar wasn't over yet. As the humans and Zalfar prepared for the final push, they knew one thing for certain. They had come together as allies, not just for survival, but for victory. And they would stand united until the very end. The tide had turned, and the Xoreth would soon learn that they had underestimated the strength of the human spirit and the unbreakable resolve of the Zalfar. The battle for Zalfar had reached a critical point. The Xoreth forces were regrouping after their initial losses, but the humans and Zalfar had no intention of giving up. Despite the chaos of the battlefield, a sense of determination had settled over the defenders. They had already proven that they could hold their ground, and they were ready to fight to the very end. Captain Naomi Stark stood at the front of the defense line, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the Xoreth war machines were preparing for their next assault. The Zalfar had fought hard, and the humans had done everything they could to help, but it was clear now that this was it. The final push would decide the fate of the planet. "Commander Stark, we've got another wave coming in," Lieutenant Jackson said, his voice tight with tension. They've regrouped, and this time, they'd brought in heavier firepower. Stark's heart sank. The Xoreth weren't done yet. They had lost a significant number of troops, but their forces were still formidable. The war machines, though damaged, were still moving forward, and their sheer size and strength made them nearly impossible to stop with conventional weapons. "We need to get that cannon back online," Stark said, turning to Kaller, who had been coordinating the Zalfar forces. "How much time do we have?" Kaller's face was drawn, sweat beading on his forehead. "The weapon is unstable, Captain. We can't fire it again without risking a complete meltdown. If we do, we might take out half of Zalfar's surface with it." Stark clenched her fists. The weapon had been their most powerful tool, but it was also dangerous. The risks were immense, but so were the stakes. They couldn't afford to back down now. "We'll take that risk," she said firmly. "Tell your engineers to prepare it. We need to end this now." Kaller hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "Understood. We'll begin the process immediately." With that, the humans and Zalfar soldiers took their positions, preparing for the inevitable onslaught. The Xoreth were closing in, and it was clear that this battle would determine the fate of both the planet and its defenders. As the ground trembled beneath them, Stark watched the enemy approach, her mind racing. She knew that the Xoreth wouldn't hesitate to unleash everything they had. It was a fight for survival, and they had no choice but to keep pushing forward. "Everyone stay sharp," Stark shouted to her squad. "This is it. We hold the line, no matter what." The soldiers nodded, gripping their weapons tighter. The Xoreth were relentless, but the humans and Zalfar were just as determined. They had already proven that they could stand together, and they wouldn't let the Xoreth win. The first wave of Xoreth soldiers charged forward, their massive forms advancing relentlessly. Plasma blasts lit up the sky as the humans and Zalfar returned fire. The energy weapons fired in rapid bursts, striking the Xoreth soldiers and sending them to the ground. But the Xoreth were undeterred. They pressed on, pushing forward with terrifying speed. "Keep firing. Don't let them through," Lieutenant Jackson shouted, directing his soldiers to focus on the advancing enemy. The battlefield was chaos, with explosions and gunfire echoing across the landscape. Stark could feel the tension in the air, the heavy weight of what was at stake pressing down on her. She glanced over her shoulder at the Zalfar cannon, now fully powered up and ready to fire. It was their last hope, and it was almost time. "Ready to fire, Captain," Kaller called from the control station. "We're locked on target." Stark took one last look at the battlefield before giving the order. "Fire the cannon." The ground shook as the massive beam of energy erupted from the cannon's core, tearing through the Xoreth forces with devastating power. The blast hit the enemy war machines head-on, obliterating them in a series of blinding explosions. The Xoreth soldiers were scattered, their advance halted in an instant. For a moment, there was silence. The battlefield seemed to pause, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. But Stark knew it was only temporary. The Xoreth would not give up that easily. They would regroup, and they would come again. "All units, prepare for another wave," Stark ordered, knowing that this would be the true test of their resolve. The Xoreth would learn from their losses and adapt, but the humans and Zalfar had learned as well. They had to keep pushing, keep fighting, or everything they had worked for would be lost. And then it came. The next wave of Xoreth forces, even more organized and prepared than before, began their final charge. Their war machines were moving faster, their soldiers more coordinated. They had adapted to the tactics the humans and Zalfar had used, and now they were fighting with a new ferocity. Stark's heart pounded in her chest as she barked orders to her team. "Do not let them break through. We fight to the end." The Zalfar soldiers fought with renewed strength, and the humans pushed forward, giving everything they had. The energy weapons continued to fire, and the battle seemed to intensify with every passing moment. But despite the overwhelming force that Xoreth brought, the humans and Zalfar held their ground. The fight felt endless. The Xoreth were relentless, but the humans and Zalfar were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting for the future, for the chance to rebuild a world that had almost been lost. In the midst of the battle, Stark could feel something stirring within her. It wasn't just the adrenaline. It was the belief that they could win, that they could defeat the Xoreth. It wasn't just about the weapons, the tactics, or the technology. It was about the will to survive, the unshakable spirit that burned within the hearts of every human and Zalfar soldier. And in that moment, Stark knew something deep within her bones. They weren't going to just survive. They were going to win. But they had to keep fighting. And they would. Together. The final battle had become a blur of gunfire, explosions, and unrelenting chaos. The Xoreth were everywhere. Their war machines pressed forward, their soldiers charging through the smoke and dust. But Captain Naomi Stark and the soldiers of the Zalfar had one thing that Xoreth couldn't understand: resolve. The humans and Zalfar stood side by side, their unity more powerful than any weapon that Xoreth had. The ground beneath them rumbled as another Xoreth war machine lumbered forward. It was a massive, armored beast, its energy cannons ready to fire. The Zalfar and human forces had already taken down dozens of these machines, but they were relentless. Stark's heart pounded in her chest as she watched it advance. She knew that the next few moments would determine everything. "We've got to take it down now," Lieutenant Jackson shouted, his voice strained as he fired his plasma rifle at the advancing war machine. Stark nodded, raising her own weapon. The air was thick with the smell of burnt metal and the sound of battle all around them. The Xoreth weren't giving up, but neither were they. "Focus fire on the core," Stark ordered. "We can't afford to miss." The Zalfar soldiers, already weary from the relentless fight, gave one final push. They aimed their weapons at the weak point of the war machine, the power core located in the center of the massive armor. Every shot counted. They couldn't waste a single shot. Stark watched the Zolfar and humans work in perfect synchronization. Their aim true. The war machine took a direct hit. The blast pierced its core, sending a shockwave through the battlefield. The machine staggered, smoke billowing from the impact site. Another shot hit it, and then it exploded in a spectacular burst of light, sending debris flying in every direction. "One down," Jackson said, his breath heavy but triumphant. But the battle wasn't over. The Xoreth forces were regrouping. More war machines were on the way, and their soldiers were closing in. The humans and Zolfar were holding the line, but Stark knew they were running out of time. The Zolfar cannon was still offline, and without it, their firepower was limited. "Captain Stark, we have a problem." Caller's voice came over the comms. "The cannon's power cells are unstable. We can't fire it again." Stark's mind raced. If the cannon couldn't fire, they were in trouble. The Xoreth had adapted, and their forces were becoming more organized. But Stark wasn't ready to give up. Not now. Not when they had come this far. "Then we fight with everything we've got," Stark yelled, rallying her troops. "We're not backing down." The Zolfar soldiers and human troops surged forward, firing on all fronts. They fought with the strength of a people who had lost everything and found hope again. The Xoreth were strong, but they didn't have the same fire. They were just invaders, merciless and cold. The humans and Zolfar were fighting for a future, for a planet that still held the possibility of life, of peace. "Push them back," Stark commanded, leading the charge herself. She ran forward, her weapon aimed at the Xoreth soldiers charging toward them. Every step was a fight, but every step was also a victory. She could see it in their eyes. The Xoreth were beginning to falter, and then, as if the universe had finally decided to give them a break, a strange sound filled the air, a hum, like the pulse of a heartbeat. Stark stopped in her tracks, her eyes wide. "What's that sound?" Jackson asked, looking around in confusion. Caller's voice came through the comms again, this time filled with disbelief. "The cannon. It's charging." The power cells had reactivated on their own. The Zolfar cannon was coming back online. Stark felt a surge of hope. This was their chance. This was the turning point. "Fire it," Stark shouted. The cannon hummed louder, its energy building. Then, in a flash, it released a pulse of energy so powerful that it could be seen even in the distant sky. The beam cut through the battlefield, sweeping across the Xoreth lines. The war machines disintegrated, and Xoreth soldiers were vaporized in an instant. The battlefield went silent once more. The remaining Xoreth forces stood frozen, their eyes wide in shock. The power of the cannon was unmatched. Stark couldn't believe it. It was a victory they had fought so hard to achieve, and now it was within their grasp. "Victory!" Jackson exclaimed, his voice filled with relief. But Stark didn't allow herself to relax just yet. The Xoreth weren't the type to surrender easily. They would retreat, regroup, and come back stronger. They had to finish this now. "Move out," Stark ordered. "We don't stop until they're gone." The final push was swift. The Xoreth had taken heavy losses, and their morale was shattered. The humans and Zolfar pressed forward, sweeping through the last pockets of resistance. Every soldier, every fighter, knew that this was the last battle. Once it was over, Zolfar would be free. As the final Xoreth forces were pushed back, a cheer rose up from the troops. It wasn't loud. It was quiet at first, but it grew, echoing through the smoke-filled air. They had won. The Xoreth were defeated. Zolfar was saved. Stark stood at the front, her eyes scanning the battlefield. Her body was exhausted, every muscle aching, but she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. They had done it. Together, humans and Zolfar had fought against the odds, and they had prevailed. "We did it," Jackson said, standing beside her. Stark nodded, her gaze still on the horizon. "Yes, we did, but it's just the beginning." Zulfar had been saved, but there was much more to do. Rebuilding would take time, and there would be challenges ahead. But for now, they had won. And that victory would forever be remembered in the hearts of both humans and Zulfar. The galaxy had turned away, but humanity had chosen to stand and fight. And in doing so, they had forged an alliance that would last for generations to come. The battle for Zulfar was over. The war was won, and the future, for the first time in a long while, looked bright.